Recently, after Wizards' takeover of EDH, they put out a tool for players to use, so they could more accurately describe the power level of their decks to facilitate better Rule Zero discussions. I'm sure you've seen a lot of hot takes from people, but now that we've had a bit more time to actually use the brackets, I wanted to reflect on how well they ended up working, and any changes that might need to be made. Additionally, April should be the end of the beta, so I wanted to talk about a few changes to the system I think might be needed. Back in the olden days of, however many months ago, there was this idea of a 1 to 10 power scale. This was something which wasn't official. It was just an idea within the community. Because of that, there was a lot of confusion about what these numbers meant. I mean, what is a 1? The worst possible deck you could make? Is that just your commander and 99 basics? Also, what's a 10? Some players would put competitive commander decks there, and some would say competitive commander is not on the scale, and the scale is just for casual players. And many players thought a pre-con deck was a 5, and assumed their deck was much better than that, so they would usually end up saying their deck is a solid 7, and therefore almost every deck was considered to be at the same power level. But of course that doesn't work, right? There have to be levels to casual EDH, right? So, brackets aim to fix this, to give players a better baseline for a Rule Zero conversation. And in that, I think it succeeded. If I tell you my deck is bracket 3, you know a few things for a fact. I only have 3 game changers at max, no mass mana denial, and no 2-card combos. Oh, I should probably explain the bracket system just in case anyone hasn't seen it yet. Bracket 1 is for decks with a very jank theme or some non-gameplay restriction. My go-to example is a buddy of mine made a deck where every card was chosen because he thought it would make a good name for a metal band, song, or album. The point of the deck was not to make powerful plays, but instead, you would cast a card and say, wouldn't Violin Tumor be a sweet name for a metal band? That was the point of the deck, right? You just played all these cards and go, oh, that's a cool name for an album. There are a few restrictions in bracket 1, no mass mana denial, no extra turns, no 2-card infinite combos, no game changers, and only a few tutors. Bracket 2 is the quote-unquote average pre-con strength, which I'll get into in a moment. It then has a lot of the same restrictions as bracket 1, other than extra turn spells are allowed, but you cannot chain them together. Bracket 3 is for upgraded decks. The only restrictions are no chaining turns, no mass mana denial, and only 3 cards from the Game Changers list. And late game 2-card combos only. Bracket 4 is playing anything, bracket 5 is CEDH. And Game Changers, by the way, are cards on this list, which are designated as powerful cards that greatly affect games. I will put a link to the article in the description. You can go more in depth on what each bracket means, and the whole article, it's got a lot there, more than I will be covering in this video. And these brackets are great for players who, who benefits from this? If you and your best buds play EDH all the time, you likely don't need brackets, since you're already playing games with your decks and enjoy that, presumably. So it's mostly for players who play against random people at their local game stores or online. Like me, I don't have a regular play group, so I just play with patrons on my Discord server, or at different random game stores, or at conventions. So I personally have been using brackets a lot, which is great, right? Because decks have such wide power levels that we need to put them in these boxes, right? Anyway, brackets have been out for a while, so we can finally ask, are they working? And after all my personal data, along with what I've collected from people, I'm confident in saying that brackets do work. They're great. The system is brilliant. And in this video, I want to outline why I think it works so well and why you should be using it at random pods. I also want to talk about how a lot of the criticism thrown at the brackets falls kind of flat. Now, of course, this video is largely my opinion, so I wanted to hear from a few other creators and, more importantly, you. Originally, I was going to have a whole section here where I polled a bunch of other creators to see what they thought, but while I was getting responses, I had 2 that I found kind of interesting. One was from Dana Roach of the EDH Retcast. When asked, have you been using brackets, he said, yes, though in the interest of full disclosure, as a content creator, we're somewhat incentivized to at least try them out. And then I got the opposite response from Phil from MTG Goldfish. He said, I personally didn't change my deck building for Clash, or any of my personal decks, which makes sense. Ultimately, a lot of content creators have biased opinions about brackets. Either they're more likely to use them so they can make content about them, or less likely because they make content with an established playgroup. Not to say their opinions aren't worth anything, but rather a survey of content creators would be somewhat biased. So instead, I went to the people. I went to social media to see what my audience thinks. Blue Sky didn't really have a way to make a poll, so I just made one on Twitter. A simple yes, no, did you use brackets? And more people said yes than no. 42.3% said yes, 35.9% said no, and 21.8% just looked at the results. But the sample size was pretty small, only 78 votes. So I decided to try YouTube and see if that affected the results. And with a much larger sample size of 7,100, we got almost the same result. 44% yes, 36% no, 21% results. So it appears that at least those people who follow me on social media are pretty evenly split about using brackets or not using brackets. One thing I found interesting about the YouTube poll were the comments. And the top one by far was talking about how brackets created more Rule Zero discussions at their local game store, which I think does actually speak to the brackets doing something positive in terms of Rule Zero. I wanted to drill down a little bit further, so I asked my patrons as well. Have you been using brackets? What's the most common bracket you see? And do you feel like brackets accomplish their goal? The most common answers were yes, 3, yes. I asked for one-word answers. And then I had people share anecdotes and stories about brackets. The general sentiment I got was brackets have issues but are overall good. And in my own personal testing with patrons or at randoms in my game store, I keep coming across the same conclusion. The bracket system is great despite its flaws, which it does have some, and I think a lot of the issues brackets have are easy fixes. And that's why I think the system is so genius for a beta test. And I'll talk about that after fulfilling this contractual obligation. I wonder if I have a copy of Thragtusk in here. I'm pretty sure it's in this box, or maybe it's in another one. Oh, I know. I'll have my card sorting lizard help out. Jojo, get over here and help me check if I got a Thragtusk in this pile. Thanks, little buddy. What would I do without you? I wonder how other people sort their collection without a card sorting lizard. Oh, Card Castle, the easy way to digitally sort your collection. That makes a lot more sense. With Card Castle, you can easily tag your cards and help sort what box or binder they're in and quickly search up whether or not you have a card in those binders or boxes. Okay, Jojo, you can go back to building boats or whatever lizards do during the day. Thanks to Card Castle for sponsoring the video. Starting off, it's good to have a baseline understanding of what power levels are. Part of the problem with the old 1 to 10 scale was players had no clue what a 10 was. There was a lot of confusion from casual players about what CEDH even is. No, Competitive Commander is not just a strong deck, or a deck that aims to win, or a deck that plays a specific card. It's basically just these decks. Decks that regularly put up tournament results. And yes, new decks come and go in the meta, but unless you're an expert on the metagame, it's not likely you're going to come up with a CEDH deck. These decks are not just strong, but play specific cards that lean into the meta at large. And Wizards showing this as Bracket 5 can hopefully tell other players that if their list doesn't look like one of these, it's not CEDH, and likely a Bracket 4 or below. I do wish Wizards directed players to some data where they could look at tournament lists, but it's fine, people can Google it. Basically, if you have to ask yourself if your deck is CEDH, it's not. Same can be said for Bracket 1, which honestly I find as a weird inclusion. Remember my heavy metal example from earlier? My friend built that deck years before brackets were introduced. The point is to show off a silly deck, and he wasn't as concerned about winning or losing. So it is a bit odd to have this as a bracket, but I suppose you do need a slot for what is the lowest power deck. I do think the line between 1 and 2 is a bit fuzzy though. They do give an example, oops, all horses, in the article, which is great if you want to cast your horses and make horse puns. Leave your best horse puns in the comments, please. But if you're worried about a board wipe ruining your non-existent game plan and costing you the game, are you going to cut a horse for a protection spell? And then if you're doing that, at what point of you making changes to play more horses does it become an actual 2? And then what is a 2? If a bracket 2 is the average modern precon deck, then what does that actually mean? The description on the website about not having the perfect card for every situation but still able to play powerful engines is helpful, but other than game changers, how different is that from a bracket 3 deck? I understand the average game might end a little faster in bracket 3, but if you have a slower, more controlly archetype, speed of your deck might not even be that much of a factor. This leads me to some of the problems I have with the bracket system. The lines between 2 and 3 are a bit blurry, so is the line between 3 and 4. What exactly makes your deck strong enough to move out of 2 to 3? And other than number of game changers, when do you know your deck is optimized enough to claim its bracket 4? Additionally, there is a lot of discussion online about what makes a deck bracket 1. My example of the metal music theme deck might seem obviously bracket 1. But again, where's the line? Just anecdotally, I remember a Reddit post where a player said their deck was a zombie with only wizards. And although only having lands and wizards in your deck is a big restriction, they did mention having Laboratory Maniac. And a zombie's draw power with Laboratory Maniac actually doesn't seem that bad, and there's a lot of supporting wizards. So is it bracket 1? This is something Maldhound mentioned recently on the Magic Mirror podcast. Here's a card to the full episode. But basically, he talks about how people have confused type and theme. Back in the day, where cards were individually weaker, you could say this is my elf deck, and it was kind of silly and casual. But now there's so many synergy pieces that your deck of all elves can actually do almost anything in the game. It's not as much of a downside as it once was. And he talks about how bracket 1 should be a gimmick, not a theme. So dogs driving cars, rather than a vehicle deck. He talked about it more on the podcast, check it out. And I totally agree, by the way. I think bracket 1 should be a little bit more defined as a gimmick rather than I'm playing all of a type. Honestly, the only bracket that I think is really well defined is CDH, because you can kind of look up what a CDH deck is. And while we're talking about issues with brackets, there are quite a few I've seen people bring up. The fact that it's extra homework for new players before they can even play a game. The fact that this might split the community between people using brackets and not. The fact that a bracket is pinned to the power of precons, which could fluctuate. And how this doesn't stop pub stompers and angle shooters. The wonkiness of the game changers list, and how 3 is just the new 7. And of course that can't possibly work, there's massive differences in power, right? Yet despite all these issues, I think brackets still work. Honestly, a lot of these quote-unquote problems I've seen people bring up are pretty weak. I don't think brackets are an issue for new players. When I meet a new player at a shop, I can almost always assume they're playing bracket 2 or 3. Think about it, a new player is never accidentally going to make a bracket 5, and probably won't make a bracket 1 either, so we can cross those off. And unless they dropped some serious cash on a lot of game changers and spent hours looking up powerful combos online, they probably don't have a bracket 4 list. Most players are going to have a precon, upgraded precon, or some pile they made / found online, and you can assume it's a 3 or 2. Same goes for people not using brackets. If there's such a casual EDH player that they just have whatever they made and don't pay attention to EDH news or wacky systems, they probably have a 3. Bracket 2 being pinned to whatever a modern precon is theoretically an issue, but probably won't end up being an actual problem. So of course, if the next precon is the fully powered up Cody Tutors for Nas CDH deck, then yes, the whole bracket system goes out of whack. But as the power of precons go up with power creep, so does the power of random cards new players open from packs. Honestly, if precons get better, it just means bracket 2 is closer to 3, which isn't an issue. Brackets 2 and 3 are supposed to be able to play games together anyway. And if you're worried about pub stompers, players lying about the power of their decks, then there's literally no system that could solve that. If somebody lies to you about their deck, what changes to the bracket system would fix that? Unless we have like capital punishment for people who break the brackets, it's just not going to happen. But what about the 3 is the new 7 problem? If most people are playing 3s and 3s can play with 2s and 3s can play with 4s, doesn't that just mean 90% of casual players could just play together? That can't possibly work, right? There's got to be huge differences in power levels, right? So it is true that since most people are going to find themselves in bracket 3-ish, and 3s can play with 2s, and 3s can play with 4s, then this bracket system just means a lot of people can jam games together. And that's literally why it works. The brilliance of the bracket system is you have a baseline that you can sit down with, have everyone say 3, and you understand. No mass land destruction, no fast combos, everything else goes. Part of the reason every deck is a 7 was such a prevalent meme is because it's partially true. In general, if the strongest deck at the table can't threaten to win before turn 6, then between 3 other weaker decks, you could probably handle whatever they got going. Stronger decks only sneak in wins against 3 opponents if they aren't focused on disrupting the stronger deck. I've found with good table communication, the 3 slower decks can almost always beat the 1 slightly stronger deck, which allows for a wide range of power levels within the same pod. And this works because brackets are guidelines. These aren't laws. You don't have to fit into one box perfectly because oftentimes your deck might not. You can say things like this. Oh, you're playing bracket 3? Well, mine's technically a 4, but that's only because of a really jank combo, so it plays like a 3. Oh, you all have bracket 2? Well, mine is a 3. Is that alright? I have 2 game changers. Oh, you all have bracket 3s? Well, I only brought a precon, so I'll be a little slower this game, but I don't mind joining. These are all normal things you can say about brackets in the real world against real players, and just play casual EDH against almost anyone and have a fine time. The only thing brackets can't account for is you, your individual skill, your deck building choices. Since the inception of brackets, I've seen tons of complaints online where players said that their deck was a 3 and lied, it should have been a 4 or a 5. And a lot of these like Reddit posts or stories really just come down to the opponent got off to a fast start, maybe with a Soul Ring, and they cast a snowball value creature and it never gets removed. If your deck has no interaction, then yeah, some deck might be able to snowball out of control and smash you. It doesn't mean they lied to you about the power of their deck. Your deck might be bracket 4 by letter of the law, but it doesn't mean your deck is good. You might have 4 game changers, but not enough removal or not enough card draw. A game where you get blown out probably isn't the fault of brackets, it's more likely yours. And this includes me, by the way. I mean, honestly, have you never lost a game due to a misplay? I have. What about a new deck you made that just kind of sucked? It's happened to me. I've built tons of new decks and got smashed because the deck just didn't work. It wasn't good. I've made bad decks before. The brackets have guidelines for how long a game should take on average to win, but not how long it should take for a deck to win without interaction. Even if they have a slow, lower powered deck, if you aren't playing enchantment removal, you will probably lose to an enchantment deck. It doesn't mean they're not bracket 2. And I haven't even touched on variants. Even a precon can play a Soul Ring into a 4-drop and put some pressure on even the strongest bracket 4 decks. And sometimes, even if you play removal in your deck, you don't draw the board wipe. It happens. A random bracket 3 list that hits a Soul Ring and draws really well versus 3 decks on average or bad draws might feel like a stomp. But you have to remember this is a game of chance. You can't evaluate the strength of their deck on one game alone. Think about it this way. If everybody has an equal chance to win, then you should expect to win 25% of the time and lose 75% of games, which is a lot. The probability of you losing an even commander game 8 times in a row is still 10%, which is higher than the probability of getting a turn 1 Soul Ring, which is about 8%. Because Commander is a 4-player free-for-all, you should expect to lose a lot of games with all things being even. And of course, this doesn't account for things not being even. If your deck is pretty low on lands or card draw or something that is limiting the deck even further, then you might not even have a 25% chance to win every game. And if that goes down to 20% or less, you should expect to lose a lot more games. But it doesn't mean that the brackets are messed up. People are very quick to blame something or someone else rather than themselves. I've played a lot of Magic, and variants or misplays cause me to lose way more than players tricking me in the Rule Zero conversation. I don't want to claim that nobody is a bad actor. I've run into a few cheaters in the past. I'm just saying they're a lot more rare than you might think. And I love how flexible this bracket system is. Brackets 2 and 3 allow for so many things, which is very in line with the point of the format. At least to me, casual EDH is about playing decks you find fun. I would have hated it if tutors were banned from bracket 2 and 3 because I couldn't play my silly wild research deck. I would have been really sad if all combos were banned from brackets 2 and 3. Then I couldn't do my wacky 6-card loops with Karn Silver Golem. Brackets 2 and 3 are going to encompass most players. So, having a lot of strategies available within brackets 2 and 3 is really good for EDH overall. Now, are brackets perfect? Hell no. There are for sure issues with the system. Now, I have no influence over the bracket system in any capacity, but I do want to present some changes I would make, and I'd love to hear what you, the viewer, thinks. So please, seriously, leave comments on this. I'm genuinely curious if you think these changes would be an improvement. So game changers are weird, right? Like, what exactly is a game changer? I know they're described as cards that dramatically warp commander games, allowing players to run away with resources, shift games in ways that players may dislike, block people from play, efficiently search for their strongest cards, or have commanders that tend to take away from more casual games. Now, they do specify that this is kind of a watch list, where if something would be banned, it would be on the Game Changers list, not randomly elsewhere. Although they did specify they're not looking to ban any of these cards as of now. But how accurate is this description of Game Changers? Does it apply for all of the cards on this list? Trinisphere, I think, is a very strange inclusion. If you look at most random bracket 1, 2, 3 decks, or even just an unupgraded precon, I doubt Trinisphere actually harms the decks very much. Unless there's Storm or Spellslinger specifically, I really don't feel like Trinisphere is a powerful card against almost any casual strategy. And there are lots of non-game changer cards that harm those decks way more, like Rule of Law or Deafening Silence. I guess what I'm saying is, if I wanted to be the bad actor pub stomper who's bending the rules of brackets, I would never add Trinisphere to a deck. Obviously, it doesn't waste a slot on the Game Changers list because the list can be as long as they want. They could have 1,000 cards on the list. I don't know. So you could theoretically add any moderately strong card to this list, but I dislike the idea of adding too many Game Changers onto the list, since it would just make bracket 3 a lot harder to do. Like, if there were 150 cards on the list, a lot of decks would get pushed into 4, which widens bracket 4 even more. And I'll get into the problem with bracket 4 in just a moment. I also think CDH cards like Ad Nauseam can be removed from the Game Changers list. Don't get me wrong, Ad Nauseam is strong, a pillar of competitive commander decks, one of the most important cards in bracket 5, period. But to make this a 5-mana instant speed draw 30, you need an average mana cost of like less than 2. I don't see how you could use this in a broken way in a lower powered casual deck. And in casual EDH, using Ad Naus in a life-swapping, life-lost deck is actually pretty funny, and deserves to be in bracket 2. Of course, you can rule 0 it, and say you have one Game Changer in your bracket 2 deck, but it's simpler not to do that. Although I don't want a million billion cards on the Game Changers list, there are a few cards whose exclusion is weird, like Necropotence. This card is insane, one of the most busted cards ever printed in the history of Magic. And I feel like it's way more likely a player can play Necro and use the resources it gives you to take over a game more than even like Sarah's Sanctum, which is a game changer. I also think green got away with murder on this list. The black, white, and blue 1-mana tutors are all here, but Worldly Tutor isn't. Gamble is fine because it's way weaker than these other 4. Natural Order, which is a comically busted card, is also not on the Game Changers list. Finale of Devastation, Seedborn Muse, Exploration. Not that all of these cards need to be Game Changers, but it just feels like there are a lot of very powerful cards that swing games into a 3v1, especially in green, which are not on this list. I also do want to talk a little bit more about ramp in general. In casual EDH, what I think causes the most power differences are turbo ramp decks. If you play all of the good 2-mana ramp spells, plus the 1-mana ramp spells that are allowed, and maybe a few good 3-mana ones, long as what you're ramping into is card draw and reasonably dangerous creatures, I think you can just build a deck that smashes most casual decks without playing a single game changer. And to be clear, I'm not talking about pub stompers. I'm just talking about making a deck that is way stronger than other casual lists on average without even realizing it. I wonder if there could be some resource rule, like on average having below 6 mana on turn 3, because if you're consistently able to ramp to 6 on 3 and then 7 or 8 on 4, and you're just slamming a bunch of 8 drops, I think your deck is way stronger than most 2s, even without a game changer. Another change I would make is to rearrange the brackets a bit. One of the biggest issues I have is bracket 4. Bracket 4 is way too big. Your precon with 4 random game changers is a 4. But also a fully powered Arkham Dagson deck, which is basically CDH, except Urza has outclassed him, so Arkham Dagson fell out of the meta, is also technically bracket 4. And then also a fully powered up Stax deck with Yakel Hops and all the fast mana is also bracket 4. These are 3 very different decks. Bracket 4 is just too massive. I really like the idea of a higher powered bracket. High power casual EDH is something I personally really like and have found it hard to find playgroups for that. This is another reason I really like brackets. I can say, hey, I'm playing a strong deck. It is not CDH, but it has mass land destruction, it has stacks pieces, it combos quickly, it's bracket 4, and people know what that means, or at least have some idea of it. But I think the bottom end of bracket 4 just doesn't keep up with that. I think my solution would be to add a new bracket. Break bracket 4 up into 2 separate ones. One which allows for more game changers than bracket 3, but still avoids fast combos and mass mana denial. And then bracket 4 as written would become the new bracket 5 and CDH would become bracket 6. With this change, we can separate out 2 types of decks that currently exist in 4, which are the fully optimized mid-power strategies, like Landfall, Aristocrats, Life Gain. If you have all of the best-in-class cards for these casual strategies to make a mid-range value deck, I do think you are meaningfully stronger than the average 3, but not so strong that it would be unreasonable to be in a pod with bracket 3 decks. You would just let people know, hey, this is a 4, so the other bracket 3 players can decide whether you should be focused down early or not. But I think those fully optimized mid-range decks should be separated from decks that are borderline CDH. We're talking mass land destruction stacks decks. We're talking combo decks that are just 1 turn too slow for CDH. And other high power, fast strategies like Storm or quick reanimator decks that just don't cut it in CDH. I think there's a meaningful difference between a deck with all of the tutors and fast mana aiming to reanimate Jin-Kataxis on turn 1 versus a mid-range Aristocrats deck that just has all of the best-in-class cards. So I would split bracket 4 into 2 separate brackets. Casual EDH is very strange. As a format, Commander has incredibly high ceilings for its power. Some of the best competitive Commander decks out there are fast and play some of the most busted Magic cards ever printed. And on the other end, you have Mono Green Omnath, plus 99 of Little Timmy's favorite forest arts. And trying to place yourself accurately between these 2 peaks and troughs of power can be very tricky, especially for newer players. So I like that we have both ends of power defined and a mark somewhat in the middle. Even if a player has no idea what brackets are, you can use the brackets as guidelines to find out what kind of deck they're playing. If they have no 2-card combos, no mass land destruction, and only a few tutors, you can probably guesstimate they're playing 3, sit down and play a game. I also love that brackets can't be used to separate out types of decks. You can play Control, you can play Mill, or whatever you want in bracket 3. Outside of stacks, essentially. The purpose of these is to weed out some of the things that require specific answers. Things like mass land destruction or fast combos are totally fine if you want to play that way. The problem is they require specific tools to actually deal with them. And if a deck is not constructed with those things in mind, they lack the tools to beat it. And then those decks should be in different pods. On this channel, I have said a dozen times how much I like stacks. I don't mind combos, even if I don't play them. I have no problem with people playing what they want to play. We just need a system that separates out those things from the decks that can't handle that. And the way the brackets are now, if you're playing a normal removal package with a reasonable amount of flexible removal spells, and you got 5+ turns to interact with an opponent, your deck should be fine and you can play with them. It's an organized system such that 2 players who are total strangers can both look at it and get an idea of what the other person means when they say bracket 3. This is also why bracket tournaments don't work. In general, casual EDH tournaments also suck. Like, I could take my technically bracket 3 Mina and Den list and go turn 1 Exploration, turn 2 Commander, turn 3 Natural Order into Vorinclex, and then cast a Great Henge. And for bracket 3, that is probably one of the stronger things you can do, but this isn't the purpose of bracket 3. Trying to make a sneakily powerful deck within the rules isn't the point. These aren't laws, they're guidelines. Of course, you can build a strong deck without game changers and stomp bracket 2 decks. Any well-tuned budget deck can do that. A deck that somebody has been working on for years and adjusting and turning all the little knobs such that it has just the right amount of card draw, just the right amount of removal, is going to feel way more powerful than a lot of other decks, regardless of how many combos or game changers you have. Even if your deck is all commons, you can still make it well constructed and it will still do powerful things. I mean, look at the Pauper format. There are fast combos, even though the whole format is all commons. Brackets are meant to separate play patterns. So making a deck which has strong play patterns, even if it skirts the rules, is just wrong. You're misusing the bracket system. Bending the brackets is really easy. I can make a terrible deck that's just 4 game changers and 96 basics. That's not you beating the system, you're using a tool incorrectly. If you want to do an EDH tournament, just play CEDH. It's proxy friendly and way more fun than you might think. I really hope that after the beta ends, Wizards focuses more on separation of play patterns and less on actual cards. I hope they don't add 1,000 more game changers, since that will only widen the gap in bracket 4 and probably won't fix any issues in bracket 3. There's no way to make a perfect bracket system, but I think this beta is excellent. It's honestly genius the way they separated out the styles of decks, and it only needs just a few slight tweaks. Thank you so very much for watching. This was a long video. If you made it to this point, I really genuinely appreciate it for you watching this far. Again, thank you so much for supporting me and watching this whole video. Special thanks to my patrons whose names you see here. If you want to be in the credits, the Discord, or join in on any other things I do with patrons, check out the link below.